It was supposed to be just another shift, a rainy Tuesday night at one of the city's most expensive restaurants. But when a powerful billionaire shouted across the dining room, trying to humiliate a young waitress, no one expected what came next. With one calm sentence, she didn't just silence him, she shook the entire room. What followed wasn't just a clash of status and ego, but a powerful reminder that courage doesn't come from wealth, it comes from within. The rain fell in sheets against the windows of Elysian Table, a high-end restaurant where every detail, from the imported silverware to the custom wine list, whispered luxury. It was a place where people dressed to impress and power played out between courses. For Emily Parker, a 24-year-old waitress juggling 2 jobs and night classes in nursing, it was just another shift. Tired, soaked from the walk-in, and silently rehearsing table numbers in her head, she had no idea this night would change everything. Then he walked in, Carson Hale, the media tycoon with a billion-dollar empire and an ego to match. His presence pulled attention like gravity. Conversations faded. Even the pianist seemed to pause mid-note. Emily had served difficult guests before, but the moment she saw his name on her table assignment, her stomach tightened. She didn't expect kindness. She didn't expect decency. She expected control, arrogance, and, if she was lucky, indifference. At first, everything went smoothly. She remembered his drink preference, the temperature of his steak, even the detail about seedless lemon wedges. But it wasn't enough. One slightly overcooked fillet, and his temper snapped. The sound of the plate slamming against the table echoed like a gunshot. Guests turned. The room tensed. "This is not medium rare," he roared, his voice cutting through the restaurant like a blade. "You think you can serve me this?" Emily's heart pounded. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't flinch. Years of holding back tears, swallowing insults, and pushing through fatigue had built something in her, something unbreakable. She looked him directly in the eye, her voice calm but firm. "I treat everyone with respect, Mr. Hale, whether they're eating a sandwich or a steak. You're welcome to do the same." Time stopped. The dining room went utterly still. And in that silence, Emily didn't just defend herself, she reminded everyone in that room, including the billionaire, what true power looks like. As Emily walked away from Carson's table, her heart pounded in her chest. The distance between them felt like an ocean, yet there was a heaviness in her chest that weighed her down, a strange mix of guilt and satisfaction. She hadn't intended to make a scene, but somewhere between the constant dismissive attitude he had shown her and the years of silently absorbing the same treatment from countless others, something inside her snapped. She didn't regret it, but she wasn't sure how to feel either. She had never been one to confront anyone, to stand her ground, especially not a man like him. She felt the eyes of the other customers on her as she passed them, but she kept her gaze straight ahead, her movements quick and purposeful, like a trained professional trying to shake off an uncomfortable encounter. The moment she disappeared into the kitchen, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But even then, the air didn't feel right. Her hands shook as she set the plate down on the counter, almost dropping it. The kitchen staff, too wrapped up in their own tasks, didn't notice her unease. Emily couldn't get Carson's eyes out of her head, those cold, indifferent eyes that had softened just for a moment when she'd spoken. There had been a flicker of something, but she couldn't name it. Regret? Guilt? Or maybe it was something even more subtle. She'd seen him change the entire atmosphere of the restaurant with just a glance, commanding attention without speaking, yet there had been nothing commanding about the way he'd looked at her in that brief exchange. It felt almost like vulnerability, like a crack in the armor he wore so carefully. A small part of her wanted to ask him why he had looked at her that way, but she quickly shut the thought down. She had enough problems of her own. As the night dragged on, she forced herself to ignore the nagging sensation in her gut, focusing instead on the rhythm of her work, the clink of plates, the hum of conversations, the laughter that occasionally echoed from the bar. It was a routine she had perfected, but even now, with the chaos swirling around her, she couldn't help but feel different. There was a strange calm that had settled over her, an awareness that she couldn't quite shake. She knew she had done something, but she couldn't define what. Something had shifted, not just between her and Carson, but within her. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that restaurant at the start of her shift. Then, just as she thought she could move on with the rest of her night, she heard footsteps approaching. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. His presence was impossible to ignore. Carson Hale, the billionaire businessman whose power had always been absolute, was now standing at the kitchen door, his figure outlined by the dim light from the dining area. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by an uncertain energy, something raw, like he was out of his element. For a moment, their eyes met, and for the first time that evening, Emily didn't flinch. She didn't turn away. She didn't hide behind the safety of the counter. Instead, she stood tall, a quiet challenge in her stance. Carson was silent for a moment longer, then stepped closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to her without a word. Emily took the envelope from him cautiously, a sudden chill running through her as she wondered what this was all about. Was it an apology? Some sort of payment for the confrontation earlier? She hesitated, unsure whether to open it right away or wait for him to speak. But Carson remained silent, his face unreadable, and that only added to the weight of the moment. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice softer than she had expected. There was no hint of the arrogance that usually characterized his words, no trace of the pride that had always seemed to fill the air when he entered a room. It was simple, raw, and, for a split second, Emily saw the cracks in the wall he had built around himself. "Thank you," she echoed, a hint of disbelief in her tone. "For what?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. The last thing she expected was gratitude. Not after the way he had treated her and her coworkers, as if we were all beneath him. "For reminding me of something," he said quietly, his eyes not meeting hers directly. "Sometimes, it's the smallest things that matter the most. You reminded me that I've forgotten how to look beyond the surface. How to remember what real humility feels like." Emily stood there, stunned by his words. She had never imagined that someone like Carson Hale, so used to being the one in control, could have such an epiphany. She felt a flicker of something inside her, a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. She wasn't sure whether to thank him or ask him to leave, but as she looked at him now, something had changed between them. He wasn't the arrogant, distant businessman anymore. He was human. Without another word, he turned and left the kitchen. Emily didn't know how to process what had just happened. She looked down at the envelope in her hand, still unsure whether she should open it. Her curiosity finally won out, and she opened it carefully, pulling out a cashier's check for $50,000. She felt a wave of dizziness wash over her as she stared at the number, unable to comprehend it. Back in her small apartment, later that night, she sat down on the edge of her bed, the check in her hands. Her brother, on the phone in the other room, asked about her day, but all she could do was stare at the check. Tears filled her eyes, not of sorrow, but of shock and disbelief. She had worked for years to scrape by, to survive, and now, in one swift motion, her financial burdens had been lifted. But even then, the weight of it all didn't sit right. It wasn't the money that mattered most, it was the strange moment of connection she'd shared with Carson Hale, and what that might mean for her. Carson, meanwhile, sat in his penthouse, unable to shake the weight of his own realization. The night's events played over and over in his mind, and as he sat there in the silence of his luxury apartment, he realized that no amount of money or power could ever fill the emptiness he felt. He had spent years building an empire, but for what? To look down on others? To hide from the truth about who he had become? His thoughts drifted back to Emily, and for the first time in years, he felt a pull towards something more meaningful than all the wealth he had accumulated. It wasn't just about the check. It was about what he saw in her, her strength, her integrity, and how she had made him see himself differently. Weeks later, when Carson returned to the restaurant, he wasn't there to make a grand gesture or to demand attention. He simply wanted to apologize. He wanted to do something different for once. When Emily saw him walk through the door, there was no arrogance in his stride, no condescension in his gaze. This time, he simply sat down at a table and waited for her to approach. "I never got to thank you properly," he said when she approached, his voice steady, but there was a warmth in it that she hadn't heard before. "For showing me the kind of person I want to be. I don't know if I'm worthy of your forgiveness, but I'm trying to change." Emily looked at him for a long moment, her mind spinning. She had never expected anything like this from him, and she wasn't sure what to make of it. But in that moment, she realized something. Sometimes, even the most unexpected encounters can change everything. The morning after the encounter with Carson, Emily woke up to a quiet, suffocating sense of unease. The room felt colder than usual, the sunlight filtering through the blinds casting long, muted shadows across the floor. She stared at the empty coffee cup in her hand, her fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly as her thoughts raced. The weight of Carson's check, still sitting untouched on her kitchen counter, felt like a heavy, tangible presence, something she couldn't just ignore, no matter how much she wanted to. It wasn't the money that bothered her, though. It was the power behind it, the arrogance that it symbolized, and the way it had been handed to her so easily. But more than that, it was Carson himself, the man who had broken into her life and shattered all the assumptions she had carefully built over the years. The man she had once seen as nothing more than a symbol of everything wrong in the world, now standing in front of her, vulnerable and seemingly remorseful. She hadn't known how to process his words. "You reminded me of something, of humility." That simple statement kept echoing in her mind, the sincerity in his voice almost knocking her off balance. Was it real? Was he just playing some kind of game, trying to soften her up with his charm? Emily didn't want to believe it. She couldn't afford to. The phone buzzed, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. It was a message from her brother. "Mark, you good? You looked off last night after you left the table with him. Everything okay?" She exhaled a sharp breath and rubbed her eyes. Mark always had a way of cutting through her defenses, of seeing through the walls she'd so carefully constructed around herself. She should reply, but part of her wasn't ready to confront what she was feeling, let alone share it. The vulnerability she felt was too raw, too unfamiliar. So she decided to leave it unanswered for now. Instead, she got up and moved around the apartment, trying to push the knot in her stomach away. But the truth was, she had no idea what to think or feel. Carson had apologized, and while his words had sounded genuine, the walls she had spent so many years building up couldn't just crumble in one conversation. Could they? She had spent so long fighting the system, standing on the side of justice, fighting against men like him. She couldn't just drop her guard now, not when she had everything to lose. It wasn't just about him. It was about everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for, and the ideals she had believed in for so long. What if he was playing her? What if this whole thing was a charade designed to manipulate her into believing that he had changed? But there was something different in him. Something that hadn't been there before. She wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the quiet vulnerability she had seen in his eyes, something raw and unguarded, or the way he had stayed and spoken to her like he was searching for something beyond power and money. Emily wasn't sure, but she knew she couldn't just dismiss it. Her shift at the restaurant came, and with it, a familiar, comforting routine. But as she made her way through the busy kitchen, weaving between waitstaff and line cooks, she couldn't shake the lingering tension in her chest. It wasn't the usual stress of balancing orders and managing customers. It was something else. A sense of anticipation, of waiting for something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She tried to focus on her work, pushing Carson and his words to the back of her mind, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. What was his game? Why hadn't he just stayed away, like he always did? Was this just another ploy to keep her on edge, to make her question herself, to make her doubt her own convictions? Hours passed, but Carson never showed up. By the time her shift was winding down, a quiet sense of relief washed over her. Maybe it had all been a mistake, she thought. Maybe he had been having a moment of weakness, and now, he was back to being the man she had always known. The billionaire, the businessman who saw people as nothing more than tools to be used. But then, just as she was getting ready to leave, the door opened with a soft jingle, and she froze. Carson Hale walked in. But this time, he wasn't alone. He was with a young woman, no older than 20, with sharp features and a fierce presence. Emily's heart skipped a beat when she realized who it was: Olivia Turner, the activist who had become the face of the fight against the corruption of Carson's company. She was the woman who had publicly exposed the devastating effects of the corporation's policies, and she had become an icon of resistance. The very same woman Emily had followed in the news, the one who had stood up to the power Carson wielded. For a moment, Emily stood frozen at the sight of them. There was no smug smile on Carson's face now, no air of dominance. Instead, he seemed quieter, smaller, almost hesitant. The woman, Olivia, glanced at Emily, and there was a brief moment of acknowledgement between them. A silent understanding that passed in the briefest of glances. Carson looked around the room before his eyes met Emily's. He took a deep breath, almost as if preparing himself for something. "Emily," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. I owe you more than an apology. I've been living in a world of my own making, a world where I controlled everything. But that isn't the way things should be." He paused, and Emily could see the sincerity in his eyes, even though a small part of her screamed at her to run, to walk away from whatever this was. "I've hurt a lot of people, including you. I've taken from people like you, without ever thinking about what it costs. I took you for granted. And I'm sorry. I'm trying to change. I'm trying to make things right." Emily's chest tightened. Her mind raced. Was this real? Was this some kind of stunt to reclaim his public image? Or was it something deeper, something that went beyond the corporate games he had always played? Olivia stepped forward, offering Emily a small but reassuring smile, as if to say, "He means it." And in that moment, Emily felt a shift, a quiet opening in her heart. But she wasn't sure if she was ready to let it in. She wasn't sure if she could trust this new version of Carson. "You can't just erase what's been done," Emily replied, her voice steady but her emotions swirling beneath the surface. "You can't just say you're sorry and expect it to be enough. It's going to take more than that. But I'll listen. If you're serious about changing, if you're willing to listen, then maybe we can start with that." Carson's face softened, and for the first time, Emily saw a trace of the man she had never expected to see. A man who was, perhaps, capable of more than she had ever given him credit for. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Emily stood still, the sound of her heartbeat drumming in her ears as she tried to process Carson's words. There was something about his demeanor that was unsettling, yet oddly compelling. His posture was tense, his jaw set in a way that suggested vulnerability, but not weakness. It was as if he was bracing himself for the storm that might come next. Emily could almost feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest, as if the entire world had been suspended in that fragile space between uncertainty and indecision. She wanted to walk away. The instinct screamed at her to turn her back on him and everything he represented. This was Carson Hale, the same man who had orchestrated the very injustices she had dedicated her life to exposing. He had built an empire on deceit, on manipulating the very people who had trusted him. And now, after years of causing harm, he was standing in front of her, trying to convince her that he had changed, that he had found remorse in the wake of his destruction. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. This was just another tactic, another ploy to regain his control, to rewrite his narrative in a way that would allow him to slip back into power without facing the consequences of his actions. But then there was that flicker in his eyes, the same intensity, yes, but now tempered by something deeper. Regret? Sincerity? Emily couldn't quite place it, but it was enough to make her pause. What if, a terrifying thought suddenly swirled in her mind, what if he was actually telling the truth? Her mind spun with conflicting emotions. She had spent her entire life building walls around herself, a fortress of skepticism and self-reliance. Trust was a luxury she could not afford. She had seen too much, endured too many betrayals, to simply accept someone's words without proof. And yet, as much as she wanted to dismiss Carson's apology as another manipulation, a small voice inside her urged her to consider the possibility that this time might be different. I know it's not enough, Carson's voice cut through the silence, and Emily snapped back to the present. His words were almost raw, and for the first time since their conversation began, she could hear the crack in his tone. I know that nothing I say can erase the years of damage I've caused. But I want to make it right, Emily. I don't expect forgiveness. I need to make things right, somehow. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She had seen men like him before, men who wore their power like a shield, never allowing anyone to see their weakness. But Carson was different. He wasn't pleading for sympathy, nor was he trying to justify his actions. There was no arrogance in his voice, only an unspoken weight of guilt that seemed to settle deeper with each word. Emily's heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the rush of conflicting emotions. Anger flared within her, the anger she had suppressed for so long, the anger that had fueled her fight against him and the corrupt empire he had built. But underneath that anger was something else, something she couldn't quite grasp. Was it hope? Doubt? Or was it simply the fear of being deceived again? She glanced at Olivia, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Her arms were crossed in front of her, her stance firm yet calm, as if she had already made her peace with the situation. Emily could sense that Olivia was more certain than she was, that she had already decided that this was the right path forward. But Emily wasn't ready to make that choice. She needed more. She needed to feel sure, even if that meant questioning everything she thought she knew about Carson. I can't just take your word for it, Carson, Emily finally said, her voice steadier than she felt. I need actions, not promises. You've spent your entire life building a system based on lies, on exploiting others for your gain. You can't undo that with a few words. If you want to make things right, you have to show me, you have to tear down what you've built and rebuild it. You have to prove that you're willing to sacrifice everything you've worked for to make it right. Only then will I even consider trusting you. Carson's eyes softened at her words, the hardness in his gaze giving way to something rawer, more vulnerable. There was no trace of the confident, calculating man who had once been untouchable. This was a man who had come face to face with his own guilt, and for the first time, he was willing to confront it. "I understand," Carson said, his voice low but resolute. "I know it won't be easy, and I know I'll have to make things right, no matter the cost. But I will do it, Emily. I will do whatever it takes. For you, for the people I've hurt, for the future I want to build. I will make it right." Emily stared at him, searching for any sign that he might be deceiving her. There were no easy answers, no guarantees. She wanted to believe him, God, how much she wanted to believe him, but she knew better than to trust someone like Carson Hale without seeing real change. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not now, not ever. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized that there was a part of her, small, but undeniably there, that hoped he meant what he said. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm not going to make it easy for you, Carson. If you think for a second that I'll let you off the hook, you're wrong. But I'll give you a chance. I'll give you one chance to prove that you're capable of real change." Carson nodded, his face etched with resolve. "I won't let you down. I promise." As Emily turned to leave, her heart was a whirlwind of uncertainty. She didn't know if she had made the right choice, but she couldn't ignore the part of her that believed in second chances. She could only hope that this time, she wasn't making a mistake. The drive back to the office was nothing short of excruciating. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were pale, her grip the only thing tethering her to the present moment. The hum of the car's engine seemed distant, as though it were part of a world she was no longer fully engaged with. Her mind was too busy, too loud, the thoughts ricocheting off each other in a chaotic, endless loop. She had given Carson Hale a chance, a moment of vulnerability, but now she couldn't escape the weight of her own doubt. What if it was a mistake? The question haunted her, each word like a dagger being twisted deeper into her thoughts. Every mile that passed felt like 1,000. She couldn't decide if the silence was comforting or suffocating. She tried to focus on the road, but her mind kept flashing back to that moment in Carson's office when he had opened up, when he had said things that, for a brief moment, had made her believe in his sincerity. His eyes had been clear, the guarded mask he wore for so long cracking under the pressure of his confession. There had been no arrogance, no defensiveness, just a raw vulnerability that she hadn't expected from a man like him. Yet, despite the sincerity in his voice, doubt gnawed at her from the inside. Had he been lying? Had he learned the art of manipulation so well that even his remorse was a performance? She thought of the years of pain he had caused, the destruction he had left in his wake, the lives he had shattered. Could someone like him really change? Was this real? Or was it just another game? The closer she got to the office, the heavier the burden of indecision felt. She could almost feel the weight pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to focus. What had she gotten herself into? The constant hum of her thoughts was growing louder, drowning out everything else. She reached the familiar streets of the city, but even the comforting sight of the office building did nothing to ease the pressure building inside her. The traffic lights turned green, red, then green again, but she barely registered the passing minutes. When she finally parked and stepped out of the car, her legs felt unsteady, as though they weren't quite her own. She made her way inside, her mind still racing, her heart beating far too fast for her liking. It was as if everything she had ever believed was teetering on the edge of collapse, and one wrong move could shatter it all. Her thoughts kept circling back to Carson's confession, to the weight of his words. The problem wasn't just about him, it was about her. She was the one who had to make the decision. She was the one who had to live with it. And what if she made the wrong choice? What if, in her quest for justice, she ended up being the one who let him escape unscathed? She found Olivia at her desk, typing away, completely absorbed in her work. The soft glow of the desk lamp cast shadows across her face, but Emily could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged from the constant pressure of their shared work. Olivia looked up as Emily approached, a brief flicker of concern crossing her features. "Emily?" Olivia's voice broke through the haze of Emily's thoughts. "How did it go?" The question, so simple, so direct, made Emily's heart skip a beat. She swallowed hard, trying to find the words, but they felt like they were stuck somewhere deep inside her chest. Her emotions were tangled: anger, uncertainty, fear, all of them mingling into a thick, suffocating fog. "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice quieter than she intended. She sat down slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the desk, the cool surface grounding her for a moment. "I wanted to believe him, Liv. I really did. But now I'm not sure if I've made a mistake. I don't know if I can trust him." Her voice trembled, betraying the vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. Olivia didn't immediately respond, her gaze steady as she processed Emily's words. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes soft but piercing, as if trying to gauge the depth of Emily's turmoil. Finally, she spoke, her tone low but firm. "Em, you've been through this before. You've faced people who've manipulated the truth, who've twisted things to suit their own agenda. You know the signs. But you also know when someone is truly remorseful. And Carson. I don't know him like you do, but maybe, just maybe, he's telling the truth this time." Olivia's voice held a quiet conviction, and Emily felt the weight of her words settle in her chest. "I don't know if I can believe him," Emily whispered, her fingers curling into fists on the desk. "What if I'm wrong? What if I let him get away with everything?" Olivia stood up and walked over to the window, gazing out at the darkening city below. The lights flickered, and for a moment, Emily felt as if she were staring into a void, a vast unknown where every decision led to a different path. Which one would she choose? "You've always been someone who seeks the truth, no matter how painful it is," Olivia said, her back still to Emily. "But maybe the truth isn't always black and white. Maybe it's a little more complicated. And it's okay to admit that. You don't have to have all the answers right now." Emily's eyes burned as she listened to Olivia, a sense of understanding slowly beginning to form within her. It wasn't just about finding the truth, it was about finding balance. It was about understanding that redemption wasn't something that happened overnight, but something that was earned, step by step. And maybe Carson was trying to take that first step, no matter how hard it was. With a deep breath, Emily stood up, her resolve slowly solidifying. "I can't make a decision based on fear, Liv. I have to look at this for what it is. I need to find out if he's really changed. And if he has, then maybe I can give him that chance." Olivia turned to face her, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I knew you'd come to the right conclusion." Emily nodded, feeling the weight on her shoulders lighten just a little. There was still a long road ahead, still so many questions left unanswered, but she was ready to face it. Not just for Carson, but for herself. She wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. She was ready to uncover it. As she left the office, the night air hit her like a fresh wave, cold and crisp, but it cleared the fog in her mind. There was a lot she had to figure out, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't let fear decide her fate. Not this time. That night, Emily Parker walked away thinking it was over. But the billionaire she faced, changed by her words, quietly set something in motion. In a world where money usually writes the story, her voice rewrote his. From waitress to the founder of a life-changing initiative, she became proof that strength speaks softly, but leaves the loudest echo. And when asked why he chose her, Carson Hale simply replied, "Because when the room went silent, she was the only one brave enough to speak."